in Gaza at this point. How can you even explain this?
Well, that's a good question. It seemed as if we were on the verge of having a peace agreement, and instead we have a new massacre in Gaza. The starting point, as far as I could tell, the starting point is when the Hamas, the Islamic movement based in Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority at the end of April 2014, they formed a unity government. And this immediately enraged Prime Minister Netanyahu, first of all, because if they formed a unity government, it would mean that he would no longer have the excuse that the Palestinian Authority only speaks for some of the Palestinian people. In addition, the unity government was formed on the basis that President Abbas, he said he accepted the three conditions of the European Union and the U.S. for negotiations. Those conditions are recognition of Israel, recognition of past agreements, and renunciation of violence. So Hamas had now accepted indirectly by becoming part of the unity government, and now accepted the US-EU terms. So Netanyahu no longer had an excuse not to negotiate with Hamas, and no longer had the claim that Hamas was a terrorist organization. Hamas was now willing to accept the terms laid down by the EU and the US. Here, Netanyahu had his political moment. 3 Israeli teenagers are abducted and killed, and then he uses this moment, he exploits it to go on a rampage in the West Bank against Hamas, hoping to evoke a violent reaction, so then he could say, you see, I told you they're terrorists. So he rounded up some 700 Palestinians, ransacked homes, ransacked businesses, blew up 2 homes, killed between 6 and 10 Palestinians, hoping to evoke that violent Hamas reaction. And so he didn't acknowledge what now seems to be the case. Number one, Hamas had nothing to do with the abductions, and Hamas had nothing to do with the killings, which occurred almost immediately. Not they were looking for the kidnappers, they knew the kids were dead. But he exploited the opportunity, exploited the occasion. Hamas at first held back, but other factions in Gaza did not hold back. And soon it began to spin out of control, which is exactly what Netanyahu wanted. And the so-called rockets started to be fired at Israel. And now Netanyahu had his pretext to go in, knock out Hamas, and as the expression in Israel has it, to mow the lawn again in Gaza. On the other hand, if he did, as he did in Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, go in and destroy everything in sight in order to avoid those combatant casualties. Basically what Israel did in 2008-9 was to enter Gaza, and everything within a 1-mile radius they just leveled. And so you don't have combatant casualties. But if he tried that, he worried that the international community, after Operation Cast Lead, after the Goldstone report, they wouldn't let him do it. So he has a problem. He loses domestically if there are too many combatant casualties. He loses internationally if he causes too much devastation. So he holds back, he holds back, he holds back on the ground invasion. But then 2 new gifts drop into his lap. Gift number 1 is the vampire Tony Blair. He concocts this ceasefire proposal, which he knew Hamas had to reject, because the proposal said the blockade of Gaza would only be lifted when the security situation stabilized in Gaza. That had never been said before. There were two other ceasefire agreements in June 2008, November 2012. Neither of them talked about stabilizing the security situation as a precondition for lifting the blockade. Why did Blair do that? Because he knew Hamas would have to say no. If Netanyahu calls Hamas a terrorist organization, then the only way the security situation would stabilize is either if Hamas surrenders or is defeated. So of course Hamas is going to say no, in which case the blockade will never be lifted. So he channeled to Sisi, the Egyptian dictator, president, he channeled to Sisi of Egypt this proposal, knowing full well Hamas would have to reject it. But now Israel could say to the world, look, we accepted the ceasefire. Hamas said no. What are we to do? We have no choice but to go in and cause all sorts of death and destruction. It's all Hamas's fault. And the second gift that dropped into Netanyahu's lap was the downing of the Malaysian airliner. And he did exactly, I mean, it's kind of eerie. He did exactly what he said Israel should have done in 1989 with the Tiananmen massacre. Remember, he said, we should have taken advantage of the moment when all the cameras were on Tiananmen to commit a mass expulsion. So now, the downing of the Malaysian airliner displaced Gaza as the top news story. And so he now knew he had time to go in and commit the massacre. It was his, if I can use the expression, it was his Tiananmen moment. And he took advantage of it, and he launched the invasion. The only test for Israel, is it defending itself or is it defending the occupation? There's a simple test. Any 2-year-old can tell you what that test is. Let Israel withdraw to its internationally recognized boundaries. And then, if Hamas launches rockets, they have a right to self-defense, meaning Israel. But until they withdraw to their border, their internationally recognized border, Hamas has the right, under international law, there's no question about that. Hamas has the right, under international law, as a people's struggle for self-determination, to use armed force to achieve its independence and statehood. So you can't fault Hamas or the Palestinians for refusing to accept their annexation. In the case of Gaza, it's a double flagrant violation of international law because the blockade is illegal. So what are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to allow Israel to suffocate them to death, as Israel has been doing for the last 7 years? Are they obliged legally, morally, to lay down and die? Is that their obligation under international law? You're a mother. I know. 95% of the water in Gaza, 95% of the water in Gaza is not fit for human consumption. Are they supposed to acquiesce in that? Are they supposed to As you well know, Saudi Arabia and Egypt came out openly in support of the Israeli massacre. It was no longer behind the scenes or ambivalence. They openly, both of them, major regional powers, wanted to see Hamas defeated. The Arab League came out in support of the vampire Blair's ceasefire ultimatum to Hamas. Important factor, of course, was President Obama, who, it has to be said, it has to be underlined, it has to be emphasized, it has to be italicized. President Obama enabled the massacre. Each day, and every person watching this should remember it, each day that President Obama went out at a news conference or at a speaking event and he said, quote, Israel has the right to defend itself. Each time he said that, each time he enabled Israel to continue the massacre in Gaza. He was the enabler. Few days. Did Obama have to go out every day? Did he really have to go out every day and give the green light and say Israel has the right to defend itself? Did he really? Here's the proof he didn't. When the international uproar became you couldn't escape it anymore, because the Israelis were targeting one UN shelter after another UN shelter after another UN shelter, killing all those children in their sleep. Finally, after 1,800 dead, when the international community was beginning to wonder, have these people gone completely mad? Then the spineless, narcissistic, cynical Barack Obama finally signaled, it's enough. And what do you think happened? The next day, Netanyahu withdrew. There is the coup in Egypt. The first thing Sisi did upon coming to power, he sealed the tunnels. So now there's an airtight blockade on the Israeli side and an airtight blockade on the Egyptian side. What could they have had? It's a year since the Egyptian coup. They had nothing in Gaza to make weapons. So all they made in their quote-unquote factories in Gaza, all they made were these, what they call now primitive projectiles, which are the equivalent of, as one person put it from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, he called them upgraded fireworks. So you hear in the press, wall to wall, from the left commentary to the right commentary and the middle commentary, everybody's saying the reason these Hamas rockets were ineffective was because of Iron Dome. Iron Dome, this magnificent, brilliant, genius, invention of the Israelis and the Americans. That's what stopped it. That's so ridiculous. How can I prove it? I can give you mathematical proof, precision. 3 civilian deaths before Iron Dome in 2008-9, 3 civilian deaths after Iron Dome. Now bear in mind, so the conclusion is Iron Dome did nothing. If it's the same number of civilian deaths before and after, then Iron Dome didn't affect anything. It wasn't Iron Dome. The reason there were no civilian deaths is because these are not rockets. These are upgraded fireworks. The tunnels were apparently not vulnerable to aerial bombing and or artillery shelling. So you could demolish everything in sight, you can send in your Air Force, level everything, you can fire the artillery shells, they still survived in the tunnels. And so the Hamas fighters were popping out everywhere. And Israel now, for the first time, since the Lebanon War in 2006, in the Lebanon War, Israel suffered 120 combatant deaths. And this is against the party of God, Syria's business, the Hezbollah. Here, to date, they suffered about 65 combatant deaths, which is more than half against little Hamas. So that was the Hamas strategy. You ask, why did they fire them? I think there was a calculation that the only way to disable these quote-unquote rockets was through a ground invasion. And then when they did the ground invasion, they got caught up against the tunnels. So now let me just make two other points about the tunnels because it's important. We were told Israel had to stay in Gaza to destroy the tunnels because they were threatening civilians. They were tunneling under Israel. Number one, if Israel is allowed to send planes, tanks, and artillery into Gaza, freely crossing the border at its whim and will, why can't Hamas build tunnels under the border to Israel? Only one side gets to violate the border? Only Israel gets to violate the border? Hamas has no right to enter Israel, but Israel can, at its whim and will, enter Gaza? Is that the laws of war? Number two, let's say they had a problem with the tunnels. Let's say it's true. I mean, the tunnels into Israel. Mona, you cannot have forgotten that the first thing Sisi did when he came to power was seal the tunnels. Did he have to decimate Gaza to seal the tunnels? Why couldn't Israel have done exactly what Sisi did? Seal the tunnels from their side of the border. Number three, what kind of earth-moving equipment did Hamas have? It had spoons and shovels. Did it have tractors? No. You're telling me, you want me to believe that Israel couldn't dig a wall deeper than the tunnels to prevent people from entering through the tunnels? It had nothing. This talk about the tunnels had nothing whatsoever to do with entering Israel. The problem was the tunnels in Gaza. You understand? Not the tunnels in Israel, but the network of tunnels in Gaza, which posed a military problem for Israel. Because even if it bombarded Gaza, even if it fired artillery shells, it still had a problem. The problem is combatant deaths. 65, more than half of what Hezbollah had inflicted.
What's the end game in Gaza?
The end game, I predicted it on July 18th, and now I posted it on my website, and now everything is confirming it. What the international community, in particular the United States, wants is this. It wants to install the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. It wants Hamas to disarm. It wants then to force Netanyahu to sign on to the Kerry Peace Initiative. And the club they're going to be holding again over Israel, because Israel rejected it last time. The club they'll be holding over Israel this time is, Mr. Netanyahu, if you don't sign on, then we can't do anything to prevent war crimes prosecutions, namely Goldstone plus. So Hamas is in a very tough position now because it called for the lifting of the blockade. The U.S. will lift the blockade, and it will give Abbas credit for it, the Palestinian Authority. Enhance his stature, then lots of money is going to pour into Gaza, all of it through the Palestinian Authority, and then with Hamas disarmed, Abbas's stature enhanced, he now controls Gaza and the West Bank. Then Kerry will come in with the peace initiative. Abbas will sign it in the name of all the Palestinians. And Netanyahu, who rejected it before, will now, first of all, have more public opinion behind him because the Israelis don't want to go through another mess like this. He'll have public opinion behind him. and the U.S. will have the club of or international. The U.S. will say we can't stop it. You know, we don't control everything, and everybody's demanding that Israel be prosecuted for war crimes. And so the quid pro quo, the exchange will be, if you sign the agreement, Abbas will agree not to prosecute you for war crimes.
Would you consider that to be something good that has come out of this?
Horror. Because all it is a Palestinian defeat. Because that's all Kerry was offering the Palestinians. It'll be a Palestinian defeat, but now it's a Palestinian defeat which Hamas will be too weak to reject.